Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling cases in Appalachian history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know which places and which hours of the day or night these documented stories reach. Countless stories are held deep in the Appalachian Mountains, buried like the coal seams that brought fortune and misery to so many. But perhaps none is as disturbing as the events at the Blackwood boarding house in the small coal mining settlement of Millerton, nestled in West Virginia's hills. A simple establishment offering meals and lodging to weary miners and travelers would, by 1903, become the site of one of the region's most perplexing series of disappearances. In the early spring of 1903, county records show the Blackwood boarding house was home to 17 men, all employed by the nearby Saxton Coal Company. By December of that same year, 9 had vanished without a trace. What follows is the account of the boarding house run by the Harmon sisters, a tale assembled from courthouse records, newspaper archives, medical examiner notes, and testimonies collected by the county sheriff between 1903 and 1912. The Harmon sisters, Margaret, 38, and Edith, 35, had inherited the boarding house following their father's death in 1901. They were not native to Millerton, having arrived with their father from Pennsylvania in 1887 when the coal boom first transformed this quiet valley into an industrial outpost. According to land deeds filed with the county clerk, Jerome Harmon purchased the property using funds from the sale of a failed lumber operation near Scranton. Local records indicate the family kept largely to themselves from the beginning, though Jerome had secured a respectable position as a bookkeeper for the Saxton Coal Company. The sisters had always lived a rather isolated existence, with few in town claiming to know them well. Former classmates at the Millerton schoolhouse, interviewed by the Wheeling Intelligencer in 1904, described the young Harmon girls as peculiarly close, often speaking in half-sentences only they seemed to understand. One teacher, Mary Whitman, recalled the girls showed unusual aptitude for biology and chemistry but displayed a disturbing fascination with anatomy that prompted several parent complaints. According to the Millerton Gazette dated April 12, 1901, the sisters quickly established a reputation for running a tight establishment with uncommonly good meals, a rarity in such remote mining communities. Their mother had died during their journey from Pennsylvania of mountain fever, according to a single reference in church burial records, and the sisters were raised solely by their father in the growing boarding house. The table at Blackwood offers superior fare at modest prices, the paper reported, with a heartiness particularly appreciated by men returning from the pits. This reputation for fine cooking in a region where culinary options were typically limited to basic sustenance would later take on a macabre significance. Local merchant records from Hammond's General Store show regular purchases by the sisters of standard cooking supplies, flour, sugar, salt, and occasional spices, but curiously little in the way of meat compared to similar establishments. Samuel Hammond, whose grandfather ran the store during this period, told a folklore researcher in 1952, "My granddad always wondered how they fed those men so well when they bought so little. Said once he asked Miss Margaret about it, and she just smiled and said they had alternative arrangements for protein." The first recorded peculiarity appears in the ledgers of Dr. Thomas Caldwell, the county's only physician. In November 1902, he noted treating 3 boarders from the Harmon establishment for severe digestive disturbances of unknown origin. His notes described symptoms of extreme lethargy, mental confusion, and a peculiar metallic taste that persisted for days. All 3 recovered, though one, a miner named James Whitley, complained of lingering weakness for months afterward. By February 1903, Whitley had left the region, according to employment records at the Saxton offices. Particularly notable about Dr. Caldwell's records is a margin note apparently added after the Harmon case became public, failed to recognize classic symptoms of gradual arsenic exposure. Professional negligence I must carry to my grave. The real mystery began in April 1903 when a boarder named Samuel Codell failed to report for his shift at the mine 3 days in succession. His foreman, Russell Denton, reported to the sheriff that Codell's belongings remained in his room, but the man himself could not be located. When questioned, Margaret Harmon explained Codell had mentioned plans to seek better wages in the rail yards further west. The sheriff, William Harding, made note of the disappearance but took no further action, such departures being common in mining communities of the era. A subsequent interview with Sarah Miller, who operated the post office from within her husband's hardware store, revealed a curious detail omitted from the original investigation. Codell came in regularly to send money to his mother in Cincinnati, Miller stated in a 1905 deposition. The day before he supposedly left town, he purchased a money order for a larger sum than usual, telling me it represented his first payment on a pocket watch he'd been saving for. Strange behavior for a man planning to leave town, wouldn't you say? What makes this case particularly disturbing are the entries found in a small leather-bound notebook discovered during a renovation of the boarding house kitchen in 1967. The notebook, partially damaged by moisture and time, appears to have belonged to Edith Harmon. The entries begin in January 1903 and continue sporadically until November of the same year. What they reveal suggests a darkness far beyond what anyone in Millerton could have imagined. The initial entries are mundane, detailing meal preparations and expenses for the boarding house. But by March, a distinctly troubling tone emerges. One entry reads, "M says the broth needs something more. The men complain of weakness, but they eat heartily enough. Perhaps it's the mind that drains them." Another, dated April 3rd, states, "Samuel won't be joining us for supper anymore. His contribution to the cellar stock will last us through spring." A particularly chilling passage dated April 10th reads, "Father always said the essence resides primarily in certain organs. M has been experimenting with preparations to determine which yields the most satisfactory results. The evening stew was particularly well received today." The miners commented on its restorative properties, unaware of the irony. The Blackwood boarding house stood on the eastern edge of Millerton, a two-story wooden structure with a large kitchen that occupied nearly the entire ground floor of the rear section. According to county records, the building had been constructed in 1887 by the sisters' father, Jerome Harmon, who had worked as a company clerk until injury forced his retirement. The upper floor contained 8 small rooms where the boarders slept, while the sisters occupied 2 rooms behind the kitchen on the ground floor. Particularly notable about the structure was an extensive root cellar beneath the kitchen, unusually large for such an establishment. Original building plans filed with the county clerk's office showed dimensions nearly double what would be expected for standard food storage. A subsequent investigation would reveal Jerome Harmon had expanded this cellar in 1896, ostensibly to store additional provisions for the increasing number of boarders. Construction supply receipts from the Millerton lumber and hardware show purchases of an unusual amount of lime, typically used in that era for sanitizing and deodorizing spaces where food or other organic matter might decompose. Aerial photographs of Millerton taken during a geological survey in 1910 show the former location of the boarding house in relation to other structures. Its positioning is notable for being slightly removed from the main cluster of company housing, with a small copse of trees providing visual screening from the nearest neighbors. This isolation, while not complete, would have afforded the sisters a degree of privacy unusual in the typically dense arrangement of mining settlements. Descriptions from those who visited the boarding house uniformly mentioned the rich, distinctive aroma that perpetually filled the kitchen. Lillian Morris, who delivered milk to the establishment twice weekly, told the Millerton Gazette in 1912, "There was always a pot on that stove, winter and summer alike." Miss Margaret called it their perpetual stew, said it was a family secret how they kept it so flavorful. The men who boarded there swore it was the best eating they'd had since leaving their mother's tables. Morris continued with a detail that took on sinister implications only in retrospect. "What I found peculiar was how they'd never let me into the kitchen proper while they were preparing meals. Always had me leave the milk on the back step. Once, arriving earlier than usual, I caught a glimpse through the window of Miss Edith working at something on the large table. The look she gave me when she realized I was there, I still shiver thinking about it. Cold as a winter mineshaft that look was." The sisters maintained a small but productive garden behind the house, growing typical vegetables of the region, potatoes, beans, turnips, and cabbages. They also kept a modest hen house with a dozen chickens. What neighbors found curious, as noted in several statements to Sheriff Harding, was that despite this limited production, the Harmon kitchen never seemed to want for meat, even as other households in the mining settlement often struggled to afford it regularly. Butcher records from the period, preserved in the county historical archives, show no regular purchases by the Harmons commensurate with feeding 17 adult men. When questioned about this discrepancy in December 1903, Margaret Harmon claimed they supplemented their provisions with game hunted by the boarders themselves. This explanation was initially accepted, though subsequent investigation revealed none of the men possessed hunting rifles or had obtained the necessary permits. By the summer of 1903, 3 more boarders had vanished from the Blackwood boarding house. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: personal belongings left behind, no formal notice given to the mine foreman, and a plausible explanation offered by the Harmon sisters, usually involving sudden opportunities elsewhere or family emergencies requiring immediate departure. The second disappearance involved a miner named Patrick Donnelly, who had arrived in Millerton just 2 months earlier. According to company payroll records, Donnelly had worked 14 consecutive shifts without absence and had just received his first full wages when he vanished on May 18. Margaret Harmon informed his work crew he had received word of his father's illness in Maryland and had departed on the evening stage. Curiously, the stage operator, Joseph Chambers, had no record of Donnelly purchasing passage, though he admitted his record-keeping was not always meticulous with last-minute travelers. The third man to disappear, Robert Jenkins, was a more established resident who had boarded with the Harmons for nearly a year. A Welsh immigrant with no family in America, Jenkins worked as a powderman in the mine, responsible for setting the explosives that broke apart the coal seams. His disappearance on June 2 prompted slightly more inquiry, as his specialized position was not easily filled. Margaret Harmon produced a note supposedly written by Jenkins stating his intention to seek similar work in the Kentucky coal fields where wages were rumored to be higher. The note, preserved in the sheriff's files and examined by a handwriting expert in 1947, shows characteristics consistent with being written under duress. The expert's report states, **, the formation of certain letters and the excessive pressure applied to the paper suggests extreme tension in the writer. This document displays markers typically associated with forced composition rather than voluntary communication. **. Perhaps the most telling document from this period is a letter written by boarder Thomas Finnegan to his sister in Pittsburgh, dated June 17, 1903. The letter, which never reached its intended recipient but was found in a small box of unsent correspondence in Edith Harmon's room, expresses growing unease. **, there is something not right about this place, Mary. 3 men gone since spring, and the talk among those of us remaining doesn't sit well. Strange sounds from the kitchen at night. The sisters keep to themselves more and more. The food remains remarkably good, though there's a peculiar flavor I can't place. Several of us have had troubled sleep and strange dreams. Weldon says he's leaving next week, and I'm of a mind to join him. **. The letter continues with observations that take on a chilling quality in light of subsequent discoveries. **, last night I woke to use the necessary and passed the kitchen on my way out back. It was near 3 o'clock in the morning, yet both sisters were awake, working at something on the large table. They had the window coverings drawn, but through a gap I could see they wore aprons dark with what I took to be butchering stains. When I returned, I heard a sound from the cellar steps that I cannot describe adequately, a sort of dragging, followed by what might have been a moan, though the mind gives a man strange fancies at times. **. Neither Finnegan nor the mentioned Weldon, presumably James Weldon, according to mine employment records, ever left Millerton, at least not by any verifiable means. Both were among the 9 men who would vanish from the boarding house by year's end. A third disappearance in June, that of newly arrived miner Carl Schmidt, prompted the first documented expression of collective suspicion among the remaining boarders. Schmidt, a German immigrant who spoke limited English, had arrived in Millerton just 3 weeks before his disappearance. His few possessions included a small journal written in German, which was recovered from his room. When translated in 1904 as part of the investigation, it revealed Schmidt had noticed unusual patterns in the boarding house. **, the American sisters watch us eat with strange intensity. The older one makes notes sometimes. They speak to each other in partial sentences as if they share thoughts without words. The food makes me sleep deeply, but my dreams are troubled. I wake often feeling as if I have not rested at all. Asterisk. The local community, isolated and largely focused on the daily struggle of mining life, took little notice of these disappearances initially. When questioned years later, many residents claimed they assumed the missing men had simply moved on, as was common in such transient communities. The sisters' standing in the community, while not warm, was respectful. They attended Sunday services at the Millerton Methodist Church, made regular contributions to the collection plate, and kept to themselves otherwise. Reverend Silas Thornton, who served the Millerton Methodist congregation from 1899 to 1910, noted in his personal journal, archived in the West Virginia Historical Society collection *, the Harmon women present a curious case of devotion without warmth. They fulfill their Christian obligations meticulously, yet there is something in their manner that keeps others at a distance. Miss Margaret in particular has eyes that seem to look through rather than at those she addresses. Asterisk. A passage from later in Thornton's journal, dated August 1903, reads, had a most disturbing conversation with Miss Edith after service today. She inquired whether I believed that the consumption of bread and wine during communion literally transformed one's spirit through the taking in of divine essence. Her phrasing had a peculiar intensity that I found unsettling. Asterisk. By late summer, 4 more boarders had vanished: William Casey, an Irish immigrant who had worked in the mines for 3 years, Frederick Mueller, another German who had arrived with Schmidt but lasted several months longer, John Peterson, a Swede who had previously worked the iron ranges of Minnesota, and Anthony Ricci, an Italian who had come to the mines after working the railroads further east. Each disappearance followed the established pattern: no formal departure, belongings left behind, and plausible explanations provided by the sisters. Notable about this group is that all 4 had received their monthly wages within 3 days of vanishing. Payroll records indicate they had been paid on August 25, and none reported for their shifts on August 29. The sisters' explanation for this cluster of disappearances involved a labor recruiter who had supposedly visited the boarding house offering higher wages at a new operation in Ohio. This account was initially accepted, as such recruitment was not uncommon, though usually conducted more openly. No one in Millerton recalled seeing any such recruiter, but the isolated nature of the boarding house made this lack of corroboration unremarkable at the time. It wasn't until December 1903 that suspicions began to take more concrete form. According to sheriff's records, on December 11, Michael Donovan, a boarder of 6 months standing, failed to return to the boarding house after his shift. Unlike the others, Donovan had explicitly told fellow miners of his satisfaction with his lodgings and had no intentions of leaving. More significantly, he had just received his monthly wages and had spoken of sending money to his mother in Baltimore, as was his custom. Donovan's co-worker, Timothy Sullivan, provided testimony that on the day of his disappearance, Donovan had mentioned feeling unusually tired after meals for several days. He told me he was having strange dreams, too, Sullivan stated in his deposition. Asterisk said he'd wake up feeling like he couldn't move properly, like his limbs were made of lead. I suggested he might be coming down with something, but he was convinced there was something in the food. Said he was going to speak with the sisters about it that evening. Asterisk. When Donovan remained missing for 3 days, his work partner, Edwin Gallagher, approached Sheriff Harding with his concerns. What distinguished Gallagher's report from previous inquiries was his mention of a specific observation. Late one night, returning from an illicit card game in the woods beyond the settlement, Gallagher had observed the Harmon sisters struggling with a heavy trunk, moving it from the boarding house to their small carriage shed behind the property. In his statement, Gallagher elaborated, it was near midnight, and I was taking the path behind the properties to avoid being seen coming back so late. I saw light from a lantern by the Harmon's back door and slowed my approach. The sisters were wrestling with a large trunk, one I recognized as belonging to Michael. It took both of them to lift it, and they seemed to be struggling considerably with the weight. What struck me as particularly strange was that they were working in almost complete silence. No grunts of effort, No discussion of how to manage the awkward burden, just focused, silent labor, as if they'd done this many times before. Asterisk. Sheriff Harding's subsequent interview with the sisters revealed nothing conclusive. They claimed the trunk contained winter bedding being moved to storage and expressed appropriate concern over Donovan's disappearance. Margaret Harmon suggested perhaps he had met with an accident while walking the forest paths after dark, a not uncommon occurrence in the rugged terrain surrounding Millerton. The sheriff's report indicates he conducted a cursory search of the boarding house premises but found nothing suspicious. The trunk in question was located in the carriage shed, and when opened, did indeed contain quilts and blankets. What the report fails to mention, but was later revealed in Harding's personal notes discovered after his death in 1921, was that the sheriff had observed what appeared to be dark stains on several of the blankets. He dismissed these at the time as likely mud or coal dust, omnipresent in a mining community. Harding's private notes suggest he harbored doubts even after this initial investigation. Asterisk, the Harmon women answered all questions readily, perhaps too readily. Their explanations align perfectly with the facts as presented. Yet something in their manner suggests rehearsal rather than recollection. I find myself thinking of my hunting dog when he points to game. There is something here, though I cannot yet see it. Asterisk. What happened next is documented in multiple sources and marks the point at which the case of the Blackwood boarding house begins to take on its truly disturbing dimension. On the night of December 14, 1903, the remaining boarders, 7 men in total, gathered in the room of Daniel O'Brien, the longest tenured resident. According to a subsequent statement by O'Brien to the Millerton Gazette, published January 5, 1904, the men had been comparing notes on strange observations and growing suspicions. There was a pattern none of us could ignore any longer, O'Brien stated. Asterisk, men disappearing always after payday, strange noises from the kitchen at odd hours, the sisters becoming increasingly secretive, and there was the matter of the meat in our meals, always plentiful despite no visible deliveries or slaughtering. Gallagher's account of the trunk was the final piece that set us to action. Asterisk. In his more detailed deposition to the sheriff, O'Brien elaborated on the concerns that had been building among the men for months. Asterisk, Peterson had mentioned back in July that he'd woken in the night feeling strangely paralyzed, unable to move though fully conscious. We'd laughed it off then as a case of the old hag, you know, that feeling of something sitting on your chest while you sleep. But after he disappeared, Ritchie reported the same thing happening to him. Then he was gone, too. Asterisk. O'Brien continued, asterisk, we'd all noticed how the sisters watched us during meals, particularly when we tried their special stew. Miss Edith would sometimes make notes afterward in a little book she kept. When Mueller asked once what she was writing, she claimed it was household accounts, but her manner was defensive. After Mueller disappeared, we began to see a pattern. They seemed to observe us for a period, making their notes, before men would vanish. Asterisk. The men agreed to conduct their own search of the premises while the sisters slept. Just after midnight, they descended to the kitchen, using only a single lantern to avoid detection. What they discovered in the expanded root cellar beneath would become the stuff of Appalachian legend for decades to come. O'Brien's account continues, asterisk, the cellar had been divided into sections not shown on any house plans. Behind a false wall of preserved goods, we found a room containing what can only be described as a butchering station. There were knives, saws, hooks hanging from beams. All showed signs of regular use. But it was what we found in the farthest section, behind a heavy door secured with an iron bar, that confirmed our worst fears. Asterisk. The official sheriff's report filed December 15, 1903, describes in clinical terms the discovery of human remains in various stages of processing. 3 complete bodies were identified corresponding to recently missing boarders. Evidence suggested others had been there previously. The report notes a complex drainage system had been installed in the earthen floor, explaining the lack of detectable odors above. Deputy Sheriff Conrad Miller, who accompanied Sheriff Harding to the scene after being alerted by the boarders, provided additional details in his personal correspondence preserved by his granddaughter and donated to the State Archives in 1959. Asterisk, in my 15 years of law enforcement, I have never witnessed anything approaching the methodical horror of that cellar. The space had been arranged with disturbing efficiency, a processing area with cutting implements, a drainage section where fluids could be collected, and a storage space where various parts were preserved in crocks of brine or hung from hooks to dry. The organization suggested not frenzied madness, but calculated routine practice. Asterisk. Miller's letter continues with a description historians have found particularly significant. Asterisk, most troubling was the evidence of selection and categorization. Various organs had been removed and preserved separately, labeled with dates and what appeared to be evaluative notes: mild, potent, unsuitable. A leather-bound journal on a small desk contained detailed records correlating specific borders with various preparations and apparent effects. The final pages included plans for what the sisters termed the winter selection, a schedule listing 5 of the remaining borders and proposed dates for their processing. Asterisk, perhaps most chilling was the discovery of small glass jars containing what appeared to be preserved human organs, each meticulously labeled with dates. Sheriff Harding's report states, asterisk, the organization and systematic nature of the space suggests this operation had been in progress for a considerable time, certainly predating the disappearances noted this year. Asterisk. When confronted with the evidence, the Harmon sisters reportedly showed neither surprise nor remorse. According to the statement of Deputy Sheriff Conrad Miller, who was present at their arrest, Margaret Harmon's only comment was, asterisk, you can't possibly understand what it takes to keep men fed properly. Father taught us that a good meal is what separates us from the beasts. The irony isn't lost on me. Asterisk. A more extensive account of the arrest appears in Sheriff Harding's official report. Asterisk, upon being shown the evidence of their activities, the Harmon women displayed a disturbing lack of appropriate response. Miss Margaret, the elder, maintained a composed demeanor and spoke of their actions as if discussing routine household management. When informed they would be charged with murder, she expressed surprise at the categorization, stating, "What we have done is transformation, not destruction. These men were common clay. Through our efforts, they have become vessels of nourishment for others. There is economy in this that transcends your limited understanding." Asterisk. The sisters were taken into custody and held in the county jail pending trial. What happened next represents one of the more peculiar aspects of the case. On the morning of December 26, 1903, Margaret and Edith Harmon were found dead in their cell. The official cause was listed as poison, though how they obtained it remains unexplained. Some speculated they had kept poison sewn into their clothing for just such a contingency, while others suggested someone connected to the victims might have ensured the sisters would not live to stand trial. The coroner's report preserved in county records notes both women died from ingestion of a potent arsenical compound, one not commonly available to the public. Dr. Caldwell, who performed the examination, noted, asterisk, the poison appears to be of a specialized formulation, similar to compounds used in certain taxidermy preparations. The sisters exhibited none of the typical agonal presentations associated with arsenic poisoning, suggesting they may have built a tolerance through gradual exposure over time. Asterisk, this finding aligns with other evidence suggesting the sisters had been experimenting with various toxins, possibly as a means of incapacitating their victims before the final stage of their process. Several of the preserved organ samples found in the cellar showed traces of similar compounds, according to limited chemical analysis available at the time. The subsequent investigation of the boarding house revealed further horrors. A thorough examination of the kitchen uncovered that the sisters' famed perpetual stew, a large pot kept constantly simmering on the back of the stove, had indeed been supplemented with human remains. Financial records discovered in Margaret's room suggested the practice may have begun as a matter of economic necessity during the mining strike of 1897, when supplies to the remote community were severely limited. One ledger entry dated September 1897 reads, asterisk, Father says waste is sinful. The Lord provides, though not always in ways the narrow-minded would understand. The first attempt was promising, though the process requires refinement. The men noticed no difference, and indeed, Buchanan commented it was the most satisfying meal he'd had in weeks. Asterisk, but what began as desperate survival appears to have evolved into something far more disturbing. Edith's notebook entries from late 1903 suggest the sisters had developed elaborate beliefs about the properties imparted by consuming certain individuals. One entry reads, "M says we must be selective now. The loud ones make the dreams too vivid. Better to use the quiet men, the ones who keep their thoughts, their essence enters the broth more gently." Another passage dated October 1903 elaborates on this developing philosophy. Father always taught that consumption is transformation. What we take in becomes us. M has observed that different men impart different qualities. The strong ones provide physical vigor to the stew, but their minds are often coarse and the dreams afterward are disturbing. The thoughtful ones, though physically weaker, offer clarity and calm. We have begun categorizing systematically to determine optimal selections. The investigation extended beyond the boarding house to the sisters' background. County records from their original home in Pennsylvania revealed their father, Jerome Harmon, had been suspected in the disappearance of 3 laborers from his previous business, a small lumber operation that failed in 1885, prompting his move to West Virginia. No charges were ever filed, but the pattern suggests a disturbing family tradition. A deposition from Elias Thornton, no relation to the Reverend, who had worked briefly at Harmon's lumber operation, provides context. Harmon kept himself apart from the men, but he watched us at mealtimes with an odd intensity. Had his daughters serve us, young as they were then. Would ask us afterward how we felt, if we'd slept well, if we'd had interesting dreams. Seemed more interested in our responses than in the actual work we did. 3 men went missing that winter. All drifters, no families asking after them. Harmon seemed untroubled by it, said they'd moved on, seeking better prospects. Historical researcher Martin Blackwell, writing in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1962, proposed Jerome Harmon may have developed his ideas while working as a medical orderly during the Civil War. Military records confirm Harmon served with a field hospital unit attached to the Union Army's Western campaigns. Blackwell notes, field hospitals of the era were sites of extreme privation, where conventional morality often gave way to the exigencies of survival. Reports exist of desperate consumption of the dead during particularly isolated winter encampments. Harmon's subsequent behaviors suggest he may have developed a rationalized framework around such experiences, transforming necessity into philosophy. Most of the physical evidence from the case was destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1928, but photographs preserved in the state archives show the cellar's layout and some of the implements discovered. The Historical Society's collection includes a single page from Edith's notebook on which a recipe is written in a neat, controlled hand. The ingredients list is conventional until the final entry, which reads simply, tender cut, well trimmed, no more than 2 days kept. A particularly disturbing artifact, known only through description as the object itself was destroyed in the courthouse fire, was a small leather-bound volume found in Margaret's personal effects. Described in the evidence inventory as a medical reference book with extensive marginalia, the volume reportedly contained handwritten annotations correlating specific human organs with purported nutritional and spiritual properties. Sheriff Harding's notes mention the annotations appear to be in 2 distinct hands, suggesting both father and daughter contributed to this grotesque compendium. The Blackwood boarding house itself was burned to the ground in January 1904 by order of the county commissioner. Local papers reported many residents gathered to watch the blaze, some claiming they could smell cooking meat as the structure was consumed by flames. The land remained vacant until 1932, when the expansion of mining operations in the area necessitated new construction. Workers excavating the foundation reportedly refused to continue after uncovering human bone fragments, and the project was relocated. Former boarder Daniel O'Brien, who had led the investigation that exposed the sisters, provided a haunting description of the burning. As the flames took hold, there was a strange moment when all of us who had lived there, who had eaten at that table night after night, looked at each other with the same unspoken question in our eyes: what had become part of us? What had we become part of? The fire seemed almost purifying, though I doubt any of us will ever feel truly clean again. The legacy of the Harmon sisters lingered in local consciousness for generations. Throughout Appalachia, mothers would warn unruly children to behave or the Harmon sisters will put you in their stew. The phrase, Harmon hospitality, became regional shorthand for disguised malevolence. As late as the 1950s, boarding houses in the area would specifically advertise family-style meals properly sourced to distance themselves from the infamous establishment. Folklorist Eliza Manning, who collected oral histories throughout West Virginia in the 1940s, recorded numerous variations on the Harmon legend. In some tellings, the sisters could determine a man's character by the taste of his flesh; in others, they believed they absorbed the strength and knowledge of those they consumed. Manning noted, "What's remarkable about the Harmon sisters' narrative is how it has evolved from historical crime to cautionary myth within a single generation. The sisters have become archetypal figures representing the danger lurking behind seemingly benevolent facades." What makes this case particularly notable from a historical perspective is how it illuminates the vulnerability of transient workers in isolated industrial communities of the early 20th century. The men who disappeared from the Blackwood boarding house were largely without local connections, single men who had come to the mine seeking work, their absences easily explained away and rarely investigated. Had it not been for the initiative of the remaining boarders, the Harmon sisters might have continued their activities indefinitely. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, who studied the case as part of her 1962 dissertation on crime in Appalachian mining communities, notes, "The Harmon case represents a perfect storm of isolation, opportunity, and cultural concealment. In a community where daily life centered around extracting resources from the earth, where men regularly disappeared into the mines never to emerge again, the sisters exploited an environment already accustomed to loss and disappearance." Whitfield's analysis continues, "The economic structure of mining communities created perfect conditions for predation. Companies preferred single men without family attachments, as they were less likely to organize for better conditions or wages. These men lived on the margins of society, their disappearances rarely triggered systematic investigation. The Harmons recognized and exploited this systemic vulnerability, selecting victims whose absence would cause minimal disruption to the social fabric." Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is how thoroughly it was subsequently suppressed in official records. By 1910, mentions of the Harmon sisters had largely disappeared from local newspapers. When the Millerton Historical Society compiled a town history in 1927, the boarding house incident was reduced to a single paragraph describing it merely as "a regrettable criminal matter involving food contamination." This institutional amnesia might explain why the case remains relatively unknown outside of Appalachian folklore. But in the hills and hollows of West Virginia, particularly around former mining communities, the story has persisted in oral tradition. Folklorist William Barrett, who recorded stories throughout the region in the 1950s, documented 7 distinct variants of the Harmon sisters' tale, each maintaining the central elements while adapting peripheral details to local geography. Barrett noted in his collection, Appalachian Whispers, Oral Histories of the Coal Country, 1957 *, the persistence of the Harmon narrative speaks to its resonance with deeper cultural anxieties. The sisters represent a perversion of traditionally female nurturing roles, the providers of sustenance becoming the harvesters of life. In a region where hunger was a constant companion for many, the story touches on taboos around consumption and survival that strike at the heart of community fears. In 1968, during an expansion of the county historical archives, a sealed box of documents was discovered in the basement of the courthouse. Among these was a previously unknown deposition from Martha Kendrick, who had worked briefly as a housemaid at the Blackwood boarding house in early 1903. Her statement, taken by Sheriff Harding but never filed officially, provides a unique perspective on the sisters' operation. Kendrick described observing Margaret Harmon adding what appeared to be a fine powder to individual boarders' evening meals, *, she was particular about it. Some got none, others a good measure. When I asked about it, she told me it was a special seasoning that helped working men sleep soundly. I left their employ after 3 weeks, as the place gave me a constant chill despite the kitchen's warmth. More significant was Kendrick's description of the sisters' behavior. They watched the men eat with an intensity one found unsettling. Miss Edith would sometimes make notes in a small book after supper, observing particular boarders with special attention. They spoke to each other in half-sentences as if sharing thoughts without needing to complete them aloud. And always that pot simmering on the stove. Kendrick's statement continues with an observation investigators found particularly significant. One evening, I was putting away linens in the pantry when I overheard them in the kitchen. Miss Margaret said something about the quiet one being ready, and Miss Edith replied that his dreams were showing the signs. They then noticed my presence and fell silent immediately. The next morning, one of the quieter boarders, a bookish man who rarely spoke at meals, was gone. The sisters said he'd received a letter calling him home, but I never saw any mail delivered to him. The incomplete nature of the historical record leaves many questions unanswered. How many victims were there in total? Records confirm 9 disappearances in 1903, but the physical evidence suggested a longer-running operation. Had Jerome Harmon indeed initiated his daughters into these practices, or had they developed them independently after his death? And perhaps most disturbingly, had anyone in the community suspected the truth before the final discovery? A partial answer to the last question may be found in the journal of Dr. Thomas Caldwell, who treated the 3 boarders for digestive disturbances in 1902. An entry dated December 30, 1903, after the sisters' death, reads, "I cannot claim ignorance, though I wish I could." The symptoms presented by Whitley and the others should have prompted further investigation. The metallic taste they described, the progressive weakness, the strange dreams, all consistent with low-level arsenic exposure, likely used to weaken selected victims. That I dismissed these as mining-related maladies represents a failure of my professional obligation. The burden of those who disappeared after my diagnosis will remain with me. This suggestion of gradual poisoning aligns with the methodical nature evident in the sisters' operation. Rather than sudden violence, they appear to have employed a process of selection, preparation, and harvesting, terms that recur in Edith's notebook fragments. There is evidence they maintained their victims in a weakened state for days before the final step, perhaps explaining the strange dreams reported by multiple boarders. The process, as reconstructed by investigators, appears to have been remarkably systematic. Selected boarders would first be observed for temperament and suitability, with notes made on their habits and disposition. Those deemed appropriate would then receive graduated doses of a sedative substance, likely arsenic-based, in their individual portions. As the effects accumulated, the sisters would monitor the subjects' responses, particularly their dream states, which they seemed to believe indicated some form of spiritual readiness. Once the victim reached the desired state of debilitation, the final step would occur, presumably on a night when other boarders were unlikely to be disturbed, after paydays when many miners would be absent carousing in town, or during stormy weather when unusual sounds might be masked. The evidence suggests the sisters worked together in the processing, with specific roles that had become ritualized over time. The psychological dimension of the case presents particular fascination. The sisters operated their boarding house in full public view, attending church, engaging in community commerce, and maintaining a facade of respectability while concealing extraordinary depravity. Their effect, as described by multiple sources, was neither manic nor obviously disturbed, but rather detached and precise. One theory, proposed by criminologist James Renfield in his 1954 analysis of historical murder cases, suggests the sisters may have developed a shared delusional system reinforced by their isolated upbringing and intensified after their father's death. The evidence points to a gradual evolution from practical cannibalism during times of scarcity to a ritualized practice invested with supernatural significance. The careful selection of victims and preservation of specific organs suggests a belief system that transcended mere convenience or profit. This theory finds support in one of the few preserved fragments from Edith's notebook, dated September 1903. M says we must be more careful in our selections. The properties vary so greatly from one to another. Some bring clarity, others troubled sleep. The quiet, bookish ones offer the richest benefits. Their essence enters the broth differently. Asterisk. Psychiatric historian Dr. Marion Blackwood, writing in the American Journal of Criminal Psychology in 1970, proposed the sisters exhibited characteristics of what would now be classified as shared psychotic disorder, intensified by their isolated upbringing and the loss of their domineering father. Asterisk. The Harmons appear to have developed an internally consistent belief system around consumption and transformation. What began as economic necessity evolved into a complex, ritualized practice with its own internal logic and justifications. Asterisk. The financial records recovered from the boarding house present another dimension to consider. The sisters maintained meticulous accounts, showing they charged slightly below the regional average for room and board despite offering superior meals. Their expenses for conventional foodstuffs were notably lower than comparable establishments. The economic advantage of their gruesome practice cannot be dismissed as a motivating factor, particularly given the precarious nature of businesses dependent on the boom and bust cycle of mining operations. An analysis of the boarding house's financial ledgers by economic historian Thomas Reynolds in 1965 revealed the Harmons' profit margin was approximately 35% higher than comparable establishments in the region. While the psychological aspects of the case have understandably dominated subsequent analysis, Reynolds notes, asterisk, we should not overlook the pragmatic economic benefits the sisters derived from their activities. Their alternative sourcing of primary ingredients represented a significant reduction in overhead costs, translating to substantially increased profits in an industry with typically narrow margins. Asterisk. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case is how effectively the sisters exploited the social invisibility of their victims. The men who disappeared were largely forgotten by the outside world, migrant workers with tenuous connections to family and community. In the rare instances where inquiries were made about missing boarders, the sisters produced letters apparently written by the men before their disappearance indicating plans to move on. Whether these letters were forged or coerced remains unknown. Social historian Patricia Montgomery, in her 1982 study, Invisible Lives, Transient Workers in American Industry, uses the Harmon case to illustrate the broader vulnerability of such populations. Asterisk, these men existed at the margins of society. Their identities often reduced to entries in company payroll ledgers. Their mobility, while economically necessary, rendered them particularly vulnerable to exploitation and violence. That 9 men could vanish from a single location before raising systematic alarm speaks volumes about their place in the social hierarchy of the time. Asterisk. A tangential but notable element of the case emerged in 1912 when construction workers unearthed human remains near the site of an abandoned cabin approximately 3 miles from Millerton. Investigation revealed the cabin had been occasionally occupied by Jerome Harmon between 1890 and 1897. Analysis of the remains, limited by the forensic capabilities of the era, suggested they predated the known boarding house victims, lending credence to the theory the father had initiated the practice continued by his daughters. Sheriff's records indicate the remains were found buried beneath the cabin's earth floor along with several personal effects, including a pocket watch and mining tools. A partial identification was made through dental records matching the remains to a miner named Elijah Collins, who had been reported missing in 1892. Collins had been employed at the Saxton mine and, according to company housing records, had taken lodging at the Harmon boarding house shortly before his disappearance. The Blackwood boarding house case faded from public consciousness as the 20th century progressed. The mining community of Millerton itself declined following the coal bust of the 1950s, and by 1965 had become effectively a ghost town. The physical location of the boarding house was reclaimed by the surrounding forest, leaving no visible trace of the horrors that transpired there. In 1967, as part of a regional historical survey, archaeologist Richard Pullman led a small excavation of the site. Beyond the foundations of the structure, little remained to be discovered. However, Pullman's team did recover several artifacts from what had been the root cellar, including a set of unusual iron hooks and the remains of a large copper pot, its interior coated with a residue that analysis showed to contain trace amounts of human bone. It was during this excavation that Edith's damaged notebook was discovered, tucked into a space between the cellar wall and a rotting support beam. The condition of the book made much of it illegible, but the fragments that could be deciphered provided the most direct insight into the sisters' thinking. Beyond the practical notes on their operation, certain passages suggest a quasi-religious dimension to their practices. Father always said there was power in partaking. The mines take men's strength, but we can preserve it, circulate it. What would otherwise be wasted returns through us to nourish others. There is purpose in this cycle, though the world would not understand it. Another fragment reads, the dreams are the key. When they begin speaking of distant places and people they've never mentioned before, the transformation has begun. M says this is the essence preparing to release. We must act quickly then before it dissipates. The best results come from those who dream of childhood homes the night before. Pullman's report on the excavation, filed with the State Historical Society, concludes with a personal reflection. Standing on the overgrown site of the Blackwood boarding house, now reclaimed by forest, one is struck by the ordinariness of the setting. Birds sing, leaves rustle, sunlight filters through the canopy, nature showing no recognition of the horrors once enacted here. Perhaps this is the most disturbing aspect of the case, that such extraordinary evil could exist within such ordinary surroundings, leaving so little trace of its passing. The last verifiable document related to the case is a letter dated March 1969 from historian Martin Blackwell to the State Historical Society requesting access to the physical evidence recovered from the site. His request was denied on the grounds the materials had been transferred to the State Medical Examiner's Office as part of an ongoing review of historical criminal cases. Subsequent inquiries by researchers have failed to locate these artifacts in any state repository, suggesting they may have been deliberately removed from public access. And so the story of Appalachia's deadliest kitchen fades into the realm of regional folklore, a whispered warning of the darkness that can hide behind ordinary facades. The sisters' methodical depravity, cloaked in the routine operation of a boarding house kitchen, represents a uniquely American horror, one born of isolation, necessity, and the exploitation of society's margins. Today, nothing marks the site where the Blackwood boarding house once stood. The forests of West Virginia have reclaimed the clearing, erasing the physical evidence of what transpired there. But in the collective memory of Appalachia, the story of the Harmon sisters remains, a cautionary tale passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the most profound dangers lurk not in the darkness of the surrounding mountains, but in the warm, inviting light of a kitchen, where the pot is always simmering and the meal is always ready. As Dr. Whitfield noted in the conclusion of her study, the true horror of the Harmon case lies not in its gruesome details, but in how easily it could have continued indefinitely in a community where men regularly disappeared into the earth. A few more going missing raised few alarms. The sisters exploited not just their victims' bodies, but the social conditions that rendered those victims invisible in life as well as in death. The last word on the case might appropriately belong to Daniel O'Brien, the boarder whose suspicions led to the final investigation. In an interview given to the Pittsburgh Post in 1905, he reflected, I still dream of that kitchen sometimes, the warmth, the rich smells, the comfort it offered after long days in the cold, dark of the mine. That's the part that haunts me most, how welcoming it was, how easily we all accepted what was offered without question. I haven't been able to eat stew since.